On a raw morning in early November 1924, the last son of heaven stood in the gray light of the Forbidden City, while a young officer of a warlord's army read aloud an order that sounded, in that place, like blasphemy. The paper was plain, the language administrative, and the bayonets at the gate were real. Puyi, 18 years old, slight in his heavy robes, his face trained since toddlerhood to a ceremonial stillness, listened as his ancient privileges were cancelled in a few brisk sentences, the court stipend cut, the palace to be vacated, the dragon reduced to a tenant whose lease had expired. Around him, eunuchs, men who had sacrificed posterity for proximity to power, began to scurry, weep, argue, steal, pray. A dynasty that had ruled from these courtyards for nearly 3 centuries had already abdicated on paper. Yet it had lingered here in habit, in ritual, in the stubborn belief that walls the color of dried blood could keep time from entering. Now time entered anyway, wearing a modern uniform. Puyi gathered what he could in haste, passed beneath the vermilion gates that had once been closed at the whisper of his name, and felt, more sharply than the cold, how swiftly history turns a god into a man. That scene, like a tableau painted in cruel economy, contains the essence of Puyi's life, a person formed by an older world, exposed without preparation to a newer one, and used by both. If history is often written as the contest of classes and nations, it is lived as the bewilderment of individuals who awaken to find that the rules they were taught are no longer obeyed. Puyi's tragedy, if we may use the word without theatrical excess, was not that he lost a throne. Many men have lost thrones with far less noise. It was that he never knew until too late what a throne was. Not a chair, not a crown, but an agreement among millions to treat one fragile body as the pivot of the cosmos. When that agreement dissolves, the body remains, and it must learn, like any other, how to walk on ordinary ground. He was born on February 7th, 1906, into the Aisin-Gioro clan, the Golden family, whose Manchu ancestors had ridden out of the northeast to seize Beijing in 1644 and build the Qing dynasty over a Chinese civilization older than their own. Puyi's father, Zaifeng, Prince Chun, was a cautious prince in an increasingly perilous court. His mother came from the Gualgia family. The child's earliest memories, such as they were, belonged to a household that still lived by palace time, formal, suspicious, and soaked in the etiquette that protects power by making it difficult to approach. In November 1908, when Puyi was not yet 3, the old Empress Dowager Cixi, who had dominated the Qing for decades with a mixture of theatrical splendor and ruthless pragmatism, lay dying. The Guangxu Emperor, Cixi's captive and nominal sovereign, died just before her. The simultaneous deaths felt to contemporaries like the closing of an iron door. Cixi chose the toddler Puyi as successor, perhaps because a child emperor promised a manageable regency, perhaps because court politics had narrowed the candidates, perhaps because in the exhaustion of that era, even despotism groped for a lullaby. The child was taken from his parents and carried into the Forbidden City. He cried and clung, as a child will, not knowing that he was crying at the threshold of a life designed to deny him the right to cry. The court enthroned him as the Xuantong Emperor, the last of a line that traced itself through conquest, marriage, and myth into the deep past of China's political imagination. In that imagination, the emperor was not merely a ruler, he was a ritual necessity. The state was a moral diagram, and the monarch was its central point, the mediator between heaven and earth, the father of the people, the presiding conscience of the realm. The words were lofty, the machinery beneath them was human. By the time Puyi's tiny hands were guided through ceremonies he could not comprehend, the Qing state had been battered by foreign cannon and internal rebellion, the opium wars, unequal treaties, indemnities, missionary disputes, the Taiping convulsion that had bled provinces white, the Boxer catastrophe that invited foreign armies into Beijing itself. The court had attempted reform, new schools, a promise of constitutionalism, a modern army. But reform arrived like a late physician at a long fever, useful, yet unable to restore the youth that had been spent. The regency fell first to Puyi's father, Prince Chun, who faced the impossible task of steering an antique ship through modern storms. In those years, the court still tried to preserve the dignity of its symbols, the dragon banners, the queues, the lacquered etiquette of the inner court. Yet outside the palace walls, a different China was gathering its own symbols: newspapers, student associations, provincial assemblies, military units trained in modern fashion, and a rising class of men who had tasted foreign ideas and returned with a restlessness that Confucian piety could no longer sedate. The Manchu court had ruled China, but it had never become fully Chinese in the eyes of many. And now nationalism, that newest of ancient passions, was beginning to speak in the language of race and sovereignty. Puyi grew amid this contradiction like a plant raised in a greenhouse, while the climate outside shifts toward frost. His world was the inner court, courtyards that echoed with rehearsed footsteps, halls where everyone bowed and no one spoke plainly, eunuchs who hurried to anticipate whims, and dowager empresses and princes who carried their anxieties in embroidered sleeves. The boy was taught that he was sacred. He was also taught, by the behavior of those around him, that sacredness is another word for isolation. He had no peers. He had attendants, tutors, guards, and the ubiquitous eunuchs, men trained to be both invisible and indispensable, who could survive any regime by knowing how to obey. The system that surrounded him was designed to manufacture reverence, and it succeeded too well. A child treated as divine does not become virtuous, he becomes arbitrary. Puyi later described, with a candor that does him some credit, his early cruelties, ordering punishments on impulse, taking pleasure in the power to make adults tremble. Such behavior is not an exotic vice. It is a predictable outcome when authority is given without responsibility. Morality is not innate. It is learned in the friction of equal relationships, in the experience of being contradicted, in the discovery that other beings have inner lives as vivid as one's own. Puyi's world minimized those frictions. A command from his lips could send a servant to beat another servant, and the child, hearing the slap of discipline as if it were a distant drum, could mistake fear for love. In 1911, when Puyi was 5, the world outside his gates finally overturned. The Wuchang Uprising ignited a chain reaction. Provinces declared independence. The Qing government stumbled between repression and reform. The modern army units that might have saved the dynasty were unreliable. The court's promises of constitutional monarchy sounded like apologies rather than plans. Within months, the revolutionaries were bargaining not merely for reforms, but for the end of imperial rule. The negotiations that followed were conducted with a pragmatic coldness that history often disguises beneath slogans. The Republicans needed the Qing to step aside without dragging China into prolonged civil war. The Qing needed safety and a face-saving retreat. The result was the abdication edict of February 12, 1912, issued in the name of the Empress Dowager Longyu and negotiated in large measure through Yuan Shikai, the soldier statesman, who would soon reveal how thin the line is between republic and personal rule. The edict ended a civilization's oldest political form with a few formal lines. It promised that the former emperor would retain an imperial title, remain within the Forbidden City, and receive an annual stipend. His court would continue in diminished splendor, like a ceremonial relic preserved for display. Thus, China performed an odd compromise, a republic outside the walls, an imperial household within. It was a truce between ages, and like many truces, it invited the illusion that time could be paused. For Puyi, abdication was not an experience but a rumor. The child remained in the palace, ceremonies continued, eunuchs still called him 10,000 years. Yet the world had changed in a way the palace could not translate. Outside, Beijing's streets filled with new uniforms, new flags, and new arguments. The language of legitimacy shifted from heaven's mandate to the people's will, an abstraction more difficult to ritualize and therefore more difficult for a child to feel. Inside, the palace administration still ran as if the dynasty had merely moved to a quieter room. One of the peculiarities of the retired emperor arrangement was that it preserved the external form of sovereignty while stripping it of power. Puyi became, without knowing it, an actor in a play whose audience had walked out. He performed rites at ancestral temples. He received memorials from palace officials. He marked days with the rhythms of court protocol. Yet the real decisions of China, war, finance, diplomacy, were made elsewhere, often by men who had never bowed to him and did not intend to. It is hard to imagine a better education in unreality. From time to time, reality entered violently. In 1917, the monarchist warlord Zhang Shun marched into Beijing, seeking to restore the Qing. For 12 days, Puyi was proclaimed emperor again. The palace revived its old excitement. Officials returned to the language of loyalty. The dragon flags fluttered as if awakened from sleep. But restoration in the 20th century was a farce, performed with antique costumes on a stage lit by modern artillery. Republican forces bombarded Beijing. Zhang Shun fled. The child emperor's second reign ended almost as quickly as it began. The episode taught, if anyone was listening, that the old symbols could still stir nostalgia, but they could not command the future. Puyi's adolescence unfolded in this atmosphere of suspended animation. He was fed Confucian classics, texts that assumed a world of stable hierarchy and moral consensus, while the city outside experienced warlord politics, foreign concessions, and the growing ferment of new culture. If the palace had been merely conservative, it might have adapted, but it was also defensive, and defense turns custom into superstition. The eunuchs, who served as intermediaries between the emperor and the palace machinery, became both caretakers and gatekeepers. They indulged him, flattered him, and, according to many accounts, stole from him with the quiet skill of men who knew that regimes change, but property remains. In 1919, a figure arrived who would alter Puyi's inner world more than any edict. Reginald Fleming Johnston, a Scottish scholar and colonial official, was appointed as Puyi's English tutor. Johnston brought to the Forbidden City not only a language but a sensibility. He taught the boy English, introduced him to Western books, and, perhaps most importantly, treated him with a mixture of respect and frankness that differed from the eunuch's fawning. Johnston gave him eyeglasses, enabling him to see literally more clearly, and the metaphor was not lost on those who like their history with symbols. He also gave him a bicycle, an object so simple and yet so revolutionary in the palace context that it might as well have been a declaration of independence. To ride a bicycle is to discover that balance comes from motion and that control requires learning rather than heredity. Through Johnston, Puyi tasted modernity. He began to question the palace routines, to feel embarrassment at superstitions, to resent the eunuch's grip, and to imagine that he might one day regain power, not as a relic, but as a modern constitutional monarch. Such dreams were not entirely irrational. Other monarchies had adapted. Yet Puyi's dream contained a fatal flaw. He had no constituency. The new China that was emerging wanted sovereignty, not symbolism, and if it wanted symbols, it found them more readily in national flags and revolutionary heroes than in a Manchu boy behind palace walls. Puyi did not understand, because no one could easily teach him, the difference between being revered and being needed. Reverence can be manufactured by ritual. Need arises from service. The Qing court had demanded reverence as a right. The Republic demanded service as a condition. Between these demands lay a gulf that swallowed Puyi's identity. In 1922, he married. The court selected Gobulo Wanrong as empress and Wen Xiu as a consort in a ceremony that tried to imitate the grandeur of earlier centuries. The marriage, as with many royal unions, was less a romance than a political and ceremonial arrangement. Yet for Puyi, whose emotional life had been stunted by isolation, marriage might have offered a humanizing intimacy. It did not. His relationships with his wives were strained by his own immaturity, his sexual confusion and inexperience, the palace's oppressive scrutiny, and the sheer artificiality of their shared existence. Wanrong, raised for refinement, found herself locked in a gilded prison. Wenxiu, more independent in temperament, would later do what few imperial consorts had ever done. She would leave him and seek a divorce, a modern act that cut like a knife through ancient ritual. Meanwhile, Puyi's rebellion against palace life grew. He cut off his queue, symbolic severance from Manchu tradition, provoking outrage among conservative courtiers. He ordered reforms, expelled some eunuchs, tried to limit corruption. Yet even his reforms were the gestures of a captive. He could rearrange furniture in the prison, not unlock the doors. In 1923, a fire in the palace, whether accidental or linked to theft, exposed the scale of eunuch pilfering. Puyi seized the moment to expel thousands of eunuchs from the Forbidden City. The exodus was a human tragedy. Aged men, trained only for palace service, cast into a city that despised them, carrying bundles like refugees from a vanished country. It was also a political omen. The emperor, even in his twilight, could still issue commands that reshaped lives. Yet he could not protect those lives from the world that followed. Then came 1924, and with it the warlord Feng Yuxiang's coup in Beijing. The new regime had little patience for the anachronism of a court within the Republic. It abolished Puyi's special privileges and ordered him out. The expulsion, sudden and humiliating, severed the last thread that tied him to the Qing's physical heart. Puyi left the Forbidden City and sought refuge first in foreign legations, those small islands of extraterritorial power that had carved themselves into Beijing after China's defeats. He moved into the Japanese legation, and then, under Japanese protection, to Tianjin. Tianjin in the 1920s was a lesson in China's predicament condensed into one city. Concessions carved by foreign powers created streets where European architecture met Chinese alleys, where modern banks stood near old temples, where Chinese nationalism simmered within sight of foreign flags. Puyi lived in the Japanese concession at the Jingyuan, often translated as the Garden of Tranquility, a name that sounded like irony. There he tasted another kind of captivity, the captivity of dependence. The Japanese treated him with deference, invited him to imagine restoration, offered him protection. But protection is rarely free. It is the polite form of possession. It was in Tianjin that the pattern of Puyi's later life hardened. He became a man who would barter autonomy for the hope of authority, and who would discover repeatedly that the bargain was fraudulent. The Japanese, expanding their influence in Manchuria and dreaming of a continental empire, saw in Puyi an instrument, a legitimizing face for a state they intended to control. Puyi saw in Japan a vehicle for his return. Each used the other, but one had an army and the other had only a title. To understand why Puyi could be seduced by such a bargain, one must recall what had been done to his imagination. He had been raised to see himself as the center of order. He had then watched that order collapse without understanding why. He had been preserved like a museum piece in the palace. He had been thrown into the street by warlords, and now he sat in a foreign concession surrounded by men who bowed to him again. The bow, for someone trained to interpret it as destiny, is intoxicating. It whispers that the universe still remembers its old geometry. In 1931, Japan staged the Mukden incident using an engineered pretext to seize Manchuria. The following year, it proclaimed the creation of Manchukuo, a new state in northeast China, presented as independent but governed in fact by Japanese military power. The Japanese needed a sovereign to lend the enterprise legitimacy. The Manchus needed a symbol to persuade themselves that history had not ended. Puyi, whose clan had begun its empire from that region centuries earlier, seemed a perfect candidate. He hesitated, negotiated, doubted, then he went. In 1932, he became chief executive of Manchukuo. In 1934, he was crowned emperor under the reign title Kangde. The coronation was a parody of imperial tradition performed under the watchful eyes of Japanese officers. Puyi rode in processions, wore robes, received foreign envoys, signed decrees, but behind the curtains sat Japanese advisors whose advice was command. The new capital, Changchun, renamed Xinjiang, New Capital, was rebuilt with grand avenues and administrative buildings, an imperial set designed by modern engineers. If Beijing's Forbidden City had been the culmination of traditional architecture, a labyrinth of courtyards symbolizing cosmic order, Xinjiang was an experiment in colonial modernity, straight lines, surveillance, and the spectacle of progress. Puyi's reign in Manchukuo is the most morally complicated part of his story, and it cannot be washed clean by pity. Manchukuo was not merely a puppet theater. It was an instrument of imperial expansion. Under its banner, Japan exploited resources, built industries for war, and crushed resistance with methods that ranged from coercion to atrocity. Chinese, Korean, and other populations in the region experienced forced labor, repression, and the brutalities that accompany occupation. Puyi, as head of state, lent his name to this regime. His defenders argue that he was powerless. His critics reply that powerless men can still refuse. The truth, as usual, sits between. He was constrained, manipulated, and watched. He was also ambitious, proud, and willing to believe what served his hopes. Within his palace in Xinjiang, Puyi tried to revive fragments of Qing court life, rituals, titles, the choreography of hierarchy. Yet the court he built was a fragile imitation. The Manchu nobles who might have supported a genuine restoration were scattered or impoverished. The Chinese elites of Manchuria largely saw him as a Japanese tool. The Japanese themselves had no intention of granting him meaningful control. He quarreled with advisors, demanded dignity, resented interference. He discovered that being called Your Majesty does not prevent one from being treated like a clerk. His personal life in Manchukuo mirrored his political impotence. Wanrong, his empress, drifted into despair and addiction, reportedly dependent on opium, the ancient solace of defeated souls. The palace became a cage not only for Puyi, but for those bound to him by ceremony. Wenxiu had already left him. Their divorce in 1931 was a small revolution within the revolution, a reminder that modern law and personal choice were creeping even into the shadows of imperial life. Later, Puyi would take other consorts and wives, seeking in domestic arrangement what he could not find in politics: stability, loyalty, perhaps affection. Yet the palace air was poisoned by suspicion. He feared betrayal. The Japanese feared his independence. His attendants feared both. In such an atmosphere, intimacy becomes another kind of surveillance. It is tempting to dismiss Puyi's Manchukuo years as mere farce, an emperor without empire, a crown without authority. But history's farces can be lethal. Even if Puyi did not design the machinery of occupation, he sat atop it like a decorative emblem, and emblems matter. They transform coercion into order, plunder into development, conquest into liberation. Puyi's presence allowed Japanese propaganda to claim that Manchuria had returned to its rightful Manchu ruler, and that Japan was merely assisting a reborn state. The lie required a face, and Puyi provided it. And yet, here is the human knot. Puyi himself was also lied to. He believed, or persuaded himself to believe, that Japan would restore him not merely as a puppet, but as a sovereign who might eventually reclaim China. He imagined that he was playing a long game. In this, he resembled many collaborators in occupied nations, not monsters, but men who mistake dependence for strategy, and who discover that those with tanks do not negotiate with those with titles. The 1930s and early 1940s tightened the noose. As Japan plunged deeper into war in China and then into wider conflict with Western powers, Manchukuo became more militarized and more brutal. The imperial palace, with its rituals and uniforms, looked increasingly like a stage set beside a furnace. Puyi signed decrees. Trains moved troops and materials, factories worked, resistance was hunted. The language of development masked the hunger of empire. If Puyi felt guilt, he hid it. If he felt fear, he had reason. His relations with the Japanese advisors grew tense. He complained of being treated as a figurehead. The Japanese responded with flattery when convenient and pressure when necessary. The equilibrium of a puppet state depends on maintaining the puppet's belief that it is moving. When belief wavers, the strings tighten. In August 1945, the illusion collapsed. With the Second World War nearing its end in Europe and the Pacific, the Soviet Union entered the war against Japan and invaded Manchuria. The Soviet advance was swift and overwhelming. Manchukuo's military structure, built for Japanese strategy, crumpled under a new assault. Puyi attempted to flee, first within Manchuria, then by airplane toward Japan. At an airfield near Shenyang, Mukden, Soviet forces captured him. The emperor, who had been installed by one empire, now became a prisoner of another. The Soviets took him to the Soviet Union, where he lived for years in custody. Compared to the chaos of war, captivity could feel almost orderly. Yet the psychological change was immense. Puyi was no longer surrounded by courtiers and advisors. He was surrounded by interrogators, guards, and bureaucrats. For perhaps the first time, he had to speak as a person, not as an institution. His value to his captors lay in information and propaganda. He would later testify at the Tokyo war crimes trials, describing Japan's manipulation of Manchukuo. Here, history performed another of its ironies. The puppet was asked to explain the puppeteer. In 1950, the Soviet Union handed Puyi to the newly established People's Republic of China. The communist victory in 1949 had ended the long civil war that had followed the fall of the Qing and the collapse of the Republic. The new regime faced the task that every revolutionary regime faces, not only to seize power, but to remake people. Puyi was a prize specimen for such a project, the last emperor, collaborator with Japan, symbol of feudal oppression. If he could be transformed into a loyal citizen, the transformation could be displayed as a moral triumph. They sent him to the Fushun War Criminals Management Center in Liaoning, a re-education prison. The phrase management center is itself a modern invention. Revolution wrapped in administrative language. There, over years, Puyi underwent a process designed to dismantle his old identity and build a new one. He attended study sessions, wrote confessions, performed manual labor, learned to live without servants, learned to address others as equals. The methods combined pressure, ideology, and a peculiar patience. Unlike the guillotine of some revolutions, this revolution wanted conversion. Puyi's own temperament, pliant in some ways, stubborn in others, made him a complicated subject. He had been trained all his life to obey a system. Now the system changed, and he obeyed again. Cynics will call this opportunism. Psychologists might call it survival. But there is also a deeper element. Puyi had never been permitted a stable self. He had been emperor as a child, symbol as an adolescent, puppet as an adult. To be offered, even under coercion, an ordinary identity, a name without sacredness, could feel like a strange liberation. The communist state did not merely punish, it required narrative. Puyi was asked to reinterpret his life through the lens of class struggle and historical progress. In his memoirs, later published as From Emperor to Citizen, he described his earlier cruelty, his ignorance, his complicity, and his gradual awakening. One may read these confessions with caution. They were written under political conditions that rewarded certain kinds of candor. Yet one should not dismiss them entirely. Even coerced narratives can contain truth, if only because truth is often what remains when vanity is stripped away. In 1959, after nearly a decade in custody, Puyi was granted amnesty. Mao Zedong's government, confident in its power and eager to display magnanimity, released the last emperor as an ordinary citizen of the People's Republic. The symbolism was exquisite. The revolution had not only overthrown the throne, it had digested it. Puyi returned to Beijing not as a monarch, but as a man with a household registration. There is a scene, reported in various forms, that captures this reversal with a simplicity worthy of a moral tale. Puyi visited the Palace Museum, the former Forbidden City now turned into a public institution. At the gate, he was treated as any visitor. He was asked for a ticket. He paid and entered. To walk through those courtyards, no longer greeted by kneeling officials, must have been like walking through one's own childhood rendered into architecture, with the roles reversed. The palace now belonged to the people, and he was a guest. If he felt humiliation, he also may have felt a clarity he had never known. The building had always been larger than him. Now it proved it by continuing without him. He found work as a gardener, an occupation that invites contemplation. To tend plants is to submit to seasons, to accept limits, to practice patience. The emperor, who had once commanded men to rearrange their bodies before him, now rearranged soil. This is not merely poetic, it is instructive. Power, especially hereditary power, persuades its holder that the world is plastic to will. Gardening teaches the opposite. Growth cannot be ordered, only assisted. He remarried, and his later years took on a quiet domesticity absent from his earlier life. He became, in a modest way, a public figure again, not as sovereign, but as symbol. The state permitted him to join consultative bodies and to publish his memoir, turning his life into an exhibit of revolutionary success. He had once been used by Japanese imperialism. Now he was used more gently by communist pedagogy. But perhaps he was also, for the first time, using history himself. By telling his story, he asserted an authorship that had long been denied him. He died in 1967 in the tumult of the Cultural Revolution, a movement that sought, among other things, to purge the remnants of old culture, old habits, and old hierarchies. One cannot resist the final irony. The man who had embodied the old society died when the new society turned its purifying violence inward. Yet by then he was no longer a threat, not even a useful symbol for hatred. He had become, in the eyes of many, a curiosity, the last leaf of an ancient tree preserved in a book. What, then, is the meaning of Puyi's life? It is tempting to moralize. History invites sermon as readily as it invites story. One can condemn him as collaborator, pity him as victim, mock him as relic, or admire him as survivor. Each attitude contains an element of truth and an element of laziness. If we widen the lens, Puyi appears less as an individual anomaly than as a human cross-section of China's modern passage. In one lifetime, China moved from dynastic empire to republic, from warlord fragmentation to foreign invasion, from civil war to communist state-building. Puyi's body moved through these transformations like a piece of driftwood through rapids, sometimes carried, sometimes stuck, sometimes spun, rarely steering. He was at once central and powerless, famous and ignorant, revered and disposable. The contradictions of his life reflect the contradictions of an era in which old legitimacy collapsed before new legitimacy had fully solidified. His childhood shows the cost of sacralizing authority. When a society teaches that one person is born above criticism, it does not create a superior being. It creates a damaged one. Puyi's early cruelty was not a personal peculiarity, but a structural outcome. The palace trained him to believe that his feelings were law and that other people existed as instruments. The miracle is not that he behaved badly, it is that he eventually recognized, at least in part, that he had. His youth in the Forbidden City shows the danger of preserving symbols without function. The Republic's compromise, allowing an emperor to remain in a palace as a ceremonial remnant, was perhaps intended to avoid bloodshed and soothe conservative sentiment. But it also created a human being trapped between eras, encouraged the fantasies of restoration, and allowed foreign powers to see in that remnant a tool. A clean break might have been crueler. The compromise was gentler and more pernicious. His Manchukuo reign shows the moral ambiguity of power without sovereignty. Puyi was constrained. He was also complicit. He was used. He also sought to use. He wanted his throne back so badly that he accepted it from an occupier. In that choice lies a lesson about ambition. It can turn humiliation into hope, and hope into collaboration. Yet his impotence also reveals something about imperialism. It prefers local faces, because faces can smile while armies coerce. A puppet emperor is useful not because he governs, but because he makes domination look like continuity. His imprisonment and re-education show a different face of modern power, the ambition not merely to control behavior, but to shape consciousness. The communist state did what the Qing court had done in another language. It tried to manufacture a certain kind of person. The difference lay in the content and the social goal. Egalitarian in theory, coercive in method. Puyi's transformation into citizen was real in the sense that he learned to live differently. It was also staged in the sense that his story served political purpose. Here again he was both subject and object. And his final years, ordinary and quiet, suggest an ending that is neither heroic nor tragic in the classical sense, but human. He did not die in battle, nor in splendor, nor in dramatic execution. He died after illness, like countless others. The emperor's body returned at last to the common fate from which ritual had tried to exempt it. There is, finally, a philosophical reflection that Durant might have offered with a sober smile. History is less a march of inevitable progress than a succession of experiments in organizing fear. The Qing organized fear through hierarchy and ritual. The Republic tried to organize it through law and elections, and found itself undermined by faction and force. The Japanese organized it through occupation and propaganda. The Communists organized it through ideology and discipline. Each system promised order. Each produced its own disorders. Puyi lived through these experiments not as their designer, but as their specimen, his identity rewritten by each new author of China's political text. Yet even specimens have inner lives. In Puyi's memoirs and in the testimonies of those who knew him, one senses a man perpetually surprised by the world, perpetually trying to catch up to events. His tragedy was not only that history moved too fast for him, but that it moved too fast for the institutions that formed him. He inherited a throne that had once seemed eternal. He watched it vanish before he could understand it. He then spent decades trying, in different ways, to replace that vanished certainty with another. Japanese protection, imperial ceremony in Manchukuo, ideological conversion under communism. Perhaps the most poignant aspect of his life is this hunger for structure, this search for a framework that would tell him who he was. In the end, he became, if not wise, at least aware. Awareness is not a virtue in itself, but it is the beginning of any virtue that is more than obedience. The child who had been taught to expect worship learned, late, that dignity can exist without worship, and that survival sometimes requires surrendering the very symbols one once lived for. He never chose his beginning. He chose, in a limited way, his ending. To become a citizen after being an emperor is not merely to lose power. It is to discover, for the first time, the common human condition, that one must earn one's place among others, that one must live without the cushion of inherited reverence, and that the world, cold, indifferent, magnificent, will continue its patient revolutions whether or not a dragon sits on the throne.